The wind swept hard across the ridge, carrying with it the cold bite of early morning and the scent of dust and cordite. The sun had not yet risen high enough to burn away the mist that clung to the valleys below, and from her position, Sergeant Elena Marquez could see only the faint outlines of the enemy moving in the distance. She adjusted her scope slowly, her breath steady, her hands calm as they had been through countless training drills. She was not here to shoot, she reminded herself. She was here to provide support, to call out enemy movements and ensure the forward units had the information they needed. Her rifle was zeroed in not for action, but for observation, yet there was always the chance that circumstances could change. In a heart-beather team was positioned lower on the slope, a mix of infantry and engineers working to establish a temporary forward post. They relied on her vantage point to alert them of any flanking attempts. The radio in her ear crackled occasionally, with clipped exchanges from the command post, but for the most part it was quiet, the kind of tense quiet that pressed on your chest and made every sound sharper, every movement more vivid. The ridge itself was rocky and narrow, with only a few flat spots where she could lie prone without risk of sliding or being silhouetted against the skyline. She had been there since before dawn, setting up her optics, logging the positions of the enemy patrols, marking each location with the precision of someone who knew how important her notes could be later. The general had made it clear her role was not to engage unless it was absolutely necessary. There were more experienced snipers in the unit. She was just to back up, a set of extra eyes, someone to watch the angles others could not see, but watching had a weight all its own. She could see the threat forming in the distance, a small squad of enemy fighters moving with a deliberate slowness that made her uneasy. They were not rushing, they were not careless, they were making their way toward the engineers without revealing themselves to the lower vantage points. Elena tracked them through her scope, noting their route, their spacing, their rhythm. She could tell they had done this before her. Finger hovered near the trigger, not on it, just close enough that she could close the gap if the moment came. The radio hissed again. One of the engineers reported they were making progress on the emplacement, but still needed at least another 20 minutes. That was too long if the enemy reached them unopposed. The other designated marksman was positioned half a kilometer to her left, but she could tell from the enemy movement that his line of sight would be blocked by a rise in the terrain. They were in her lane and no one else could see them. She bit the inside of her cheek, weighing the order she had been given against the reality of the field. Through the scope, she could see the lead enemy soldier pause, lift a pair of binoculars, and scan the area. His gaze passed dangerously close to her position. She stilled every muscle in her body, willing herself to blend into the stone and scrub. The others moved up behind him, one carrying what looked like a tube launcher, another with a heavy machine gun slung low. This was no mere recon team. They were here to do damage, and if they reached the engineers, the cost would be severe. Her training kicked in. She calculated wind, distance, elevation, her mind running numbers with a precision of a machine. She did not even notice the cold in her fingers anymore. She shifted her body slightly to align the shot, knowing that if she fired now, she would reveal her position, but if she waited too long, the engineers would have no warnings. Thought of the general back at the command post, his sharp voice in the briefing telling her to stay hidden to avoid unnecessary exposure. She had respected him from the moment she met him, and she had no desire to go against orders, but this was the kind of choice that separated soldiers from survivors. She exhaled slowly, her finger brushing the trigger. The enemy squad reached a point where they would be invisible to anyone but her. They paused as if sensing the invisible line they had crossed. Elena felt her heartbeat slow, her breathing steady, the world narrowing to the sight picture in her scope. She focused on the lead soldier, centered him in her crosshairs, and waited for the exact moment when his head turned just enough to expose the vulnerable point beneath his helmet. Somewhere below, she could hear the distant clang of tools and shouted orders from the engineers. Oblivious to the danger creeping closer, she adjusted her aim a fraction, her mind blank of everything but the mechanics of the shot. In that moment, the ridge, the valley, the war itself seemed to vanish until there was only her, the rifle, and the target. Moment stretched like a taut wire in her mind. Elena could almost feel the weight of the decision Pressing down on her yet in the space of a single heartbeat, everything became clear. She squeezed the trigger gently, the rifle kicked against her shoulder, the sound muffled by the suppressor, but still sharp in her ears through the scope she saw. The lead enemy soldier dropped instantly, his body crumpling. Before the others could react, confusion rippled through the squad, their formation faltering as they scanned the ridge for a threat they could not see. Shifted her aim quickly, her breathing steady. The second shot came less than 3 seconds after the first, striking the man with the machine gun before he could swing it into position. The squad scattered, one diving behind a boulder, another dropping prone to return fire, but their shots were wild, aimed more at the general shape of the ridge than her actual position. Her hands moved with precision, each reload smooth, each adjustment calculated. She took another target before the survivors began retreating, their plan clearly broken. The danger to the engineers was gone for the moment, and the silence that followed was almost heavier than the gunfire had been. She let out a slow breath, lowering her cheek from the rifle stock, her pulse steady, but her mind running with the realization of what she had just done. The radio crackled again, a voice from the command post, tight with surprise, asking who had engaged the enemy on the north slope. She did not answer, at first unsure how much she should admit. Then the voice of the general came through, clipped and direct, asking again who took that shot. She keyed her mic and simply said, "Ridge support, sir. Targets were in my lane. Threat to engineers neutralized." There was a pause on the line, as if the general was weighing his words. Finally, he spoke in a tone that carried neither anger nor praise, but something harder to read. "Stay in position, Marquez. Keep your scope active." More chatter later, she confirmed, and went back to scanning the valley. Though the enemy squad had retreated, her instincts told her they might try another approach. Latter minutes passed slowly. The engineers below continued their work, moving with renewed urgency. After hearing the distant shots, a few looked up toward the ridge, though they could not see her. She imagined some of them might be guessing who had just saved them. She pushed the thought aside and kept her focus on the field. Discipline was what kept you alive in moments like this, not daydreams of recognition. Sun rose higher, burning off more of the mist, revealing the terrain in sharper detail. She could see the bodies where they had fallen, distant dark shapes against the pale earth. She kept track of movement beyond them, noting a pair of enemy scouts pulling back toward the far tree line. They would carry news of the failed advance, which meant their commanders would be aware someone on the ridge had eyes and reach longer than they expected. Her radio hissed again, but this time it was not an order but a simple message from one of the engineers, a low voice that carried more relief than formality. "Thanks, whoever you are." She allowed herself a small smile before returning her eye to the scope. The relief team finally arrived to rotate her off the ridge. She gathered her gear carefully, checking every strap and latch before making the descent. The climb down was slow, her knees stiff from hours in the prone position. She reached the base and found herself face to face with the general himself, a man rarely seen outside the command tent. He studied her with an expression she could not quite read, and then, without a word, he stepped forward and extended his hand. Hesitated for just a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, and he held it a moment longer than expected, his eyes still locked on hers. Finally, he spoke just one sentence. "You took the shot, then?" Without waiting for a reply, he gave a single nod and turned away, leaving her standing there, unsure whether that was meant as praise or simply acknowledgement. As she walked back toward the staging area, she caught whispers from passing soldiers, some glancing in her direction, others simply lowering their voices as she passed. Word of the ridge shot had clearly traveled faster than she had, and though no one openly said anything, she could feel the shift in the way they looked at her. She was no longer just support on the ridge in their ice. That night she lay in her bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, hearing the distant sounds of the base settling into quiet. She thought of the moment she pulled the trigger, of the way time had seemed to slow and sharpen all at once, and of the general's unreadable nod. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or whether she would be back on a ridge with another impossible decision to make, but she knew one thing: she would never again be underestimated by anyone in this unit. The morning after the Ridge incident, Elena was barely halfway through her first cup of bitter black coffee when a runner appeared at the tent, flat breathless and carrying a sealed message envelope with her name printed in block letters. He handed it over without a word and jogged off toward the next set of tents. She stared at it for a moment, the paper already warm from his hand, before sliding a finger under the seal. Inside was a short note from the adjutant: report to Command Tent 0800. Ours full kit. No further explanation was given, but she did not need one. Something about the way it was written made it clear this was not a routine meeting. She moved quickly, gathering her gear, even though she doubted she would need it for whatever this was. The base was alive with movement, but she could feel eyes on her as she walked the narrow dirt paths toward the command area. Whispers rose and fell in her wake. She ignored them, focusing on the task ahead. When she reached the large olive drab tent, she paused outside just long enough to take a steadying breath before ducking through the flap. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy with the smell of canvas oil, and dust. Maps covered the main table and radios hummed softly along one wall. The general stood at the far side, speaking in low tones with two other officers. When he noticed her, he waved the others away and motioned for her to step forward, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could read her thoughts. Marks, he began without preamble, you were on the ridge yesterday. His voice was calm but carried a weight that suggested the question was purely rhetorical. She nodded and answered, yes, sir. His gaze did not waver. Tell me what you saw. She kept her voice level as she described the enemy movement, the way they had been lining up to flank the engineers, her decision to engage, and the sequence of shots. She left out any embellishment, sticking only to the facts. When she finished, the general was silent for a moment, then reached into a folder on the table and pulled out a grainy aerial photograph. Sliding it across to her, the image showed the valley below the ridge with red circles marking the positions of the men she had taken down. Intelligence confirms those were not standard infantry, he said slowly. Those were advance recon from the Black Vulture unit. Her brow furrowed. She had heard the name whispered before, an elite enemy detachment known for sabotage and targeted strikes. If they had succeeded yesterday, the general continued, the engineers would have been gone in minutes, along with every piece of equipment they brought. Your decision on that ridge saved the entire operation. She felt a flicker of pride, but kept her expression neutral. This was not the time to smile. The general seemed to study her for another long moment before speaking again. I need people who can think like that under pressure. He turned and pulled a small metal case from a side table, opening it to reveal a compact rifle. Unlike the standard issue gear she was used to, this one was lighter, sleeker, clearly customized. This is yours now, he said. It is not standard because you will not be operating standard missions from here on. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Sir, he gave a single nod. You will remain attached to your unit for appearances, but when I need someone to act without hesitation, you will be the first name. Colette, the weight of the word sank in. She had been a ridge spotter less than a week ago. Now the general was telling her she was to be his precision asset. She accepted the rifle without a word, feeling the balance in her hands. Even unloaded, it felt like an extension of her body. As she slung it over her shoulder, she caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the general's mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. As mist, he said simply, and she stepped back out into the sunlight, blinking against the sudden glare. Outside, the camp noise seemed louder than before, but her mind was fixed on the meeting. She replayed it in her head with each step back toward her tent. The name Black Vulture echoed in her thoughts. She knew enough to understand that if they were in the area, the situation was more dangerous than anyone had let on. That afternoon, she returned to the range not for orders, but because the weight of the new rifle on her shoulder demanded familiarity. She set up on the far line where the wind was tricky and the targets small, running through drills until the action and reload felt natural. She experimented with hold angles and breathing cycles until each shot felt like it could have been taken on the ridge beat. The time the sun dipped low, painting the range in gold and shadows, she had burned through to full loads of ammunition and could feel the subtle shift in her own movements. The rifle was no longer new, it was hers, and she knew in her bones that whatever came next, she would be ready that night. As she cleaned the weapon at her bunk, one of the engineers she had saved passed by, pausing to watch her work for a moment before quietly saying, "We would not be here if not for you," then moving on without waiting for a response. She said nothing, but her hands stilled on the weapon for a moment before continuing the slow, deliberate cleaning motion. She did not yet know when the general would call her again or what kind of mission he had in mind, but she knew the next time she climbed a ridge it would not be just for support. The stakes would be higher, the targets harder, and the margin for error non-existent. And though a part of her felt the weight of that responsibility, another part felt a quiet, steady certainty she was ready to take the shot again. 3 days after the meeting with the general, Elena was summoned again, but this time not to the main command tent. Instead, a runner led her to a small, nondescript structure at the far edge of camp. Built from stacked sandbags and corrugated steel, she ducked inside to find a narrow room lit only by a single hanging lamp, a map spread across the table in the center with a few photos scattered on top. A tall man in plain fatigues stood there, arms crossed and eyes sharp like someone used to operating far from any. Bassi looked her over before speaking. "You are Marquez, the one from the ridge?" She gave a single nod. He gestured to the map, pointing to a cluster of red marks along a twisting river. "This is enemy supply staging. They are bringing in weapons, fuel, and comms gear under heavy guard. Normally, we would hit them with artillery, but the location is too close to a civilian area, so we need something precise." He slid one of the photographs toward her. It showed a squat concrete bunker half hidden by vegetation and a small team of soldiers moving crates inside. Deathman continued, "You will be positioned here." He tapped a high bluff overlooking the river a full kilometer from the target. "From there you will have a clear line on the bunker door. Your job is to take out the commander when he appears, which should send the rest scattering long enough for our ground team to sweep and clean. You will move under cover of darkness insertion at 00 hours exfil. Same route." There was no talk of refusal, no space for hesitation. She studied the map, committing the landmarks to memory, then gathered the small kit she would take: her new rifle, a tight load of ammunition, a light pack, and a canteen. Before nightfall, she was moving with a 2-man escort through a narrow defile that cut deep into the hills, their boots crunching softly on loose stone. Night air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth and pine. They traveled without speaking. The only sounds, the rustle of gear and the occasional low murmur from the lead escort. When they paused to check bearings just before midnight, they reached the base of the bluff. The escorts crouched in the shadows and signaled her to continue. Alone, she began the climb, moving carefully to avoid sending rocks skittering down the slope. The moon was high enough to paint the terrain in silver and black, but low enough to leave the river valley in shadow. When she reached the top, she lay flat for a moment, catching her breath, then crawled forward to the edge. The river glimmered faintly below, and she could make out the faint shapes of men moving near the bunker. She adjusted her scope, settling into position with the rifle steady against her shoulder. Through the glass she could see them more clearly now, dark uniforms, light glinting off their weapons, one figure taller than the rest barking orders in a clipped tone that carried even across the water. Studied the rhythm of movement. Men carrying crates from the tree line into the bunker, others returning with empty hands, the tall figure only appearing briefly each time a shipment arrived. She waited, steady, her breathing slow, the crosshairs never leaving the bunker entrance. Minutes stretched thin, the sound of the river and distant crickets the only backdrop. Then at last the tall figure stepped out again, pausing to speak to another man. Elena squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, echoing off the hills, and the figure dropped. Instant licheos rippled through the camp below, men shouting and diving for cover, some firing blindly into the dark toward the bluff. She shifted slightly, fired again, dropping another target near the bunker door, then rolled to a secondary position before they could pinpoint her location. She fired twice more, each shot measured before the last echoes faded. The enemy was scattering, some into the tree line, others into the bunker itself. Within moments, the first shapes of the Allied ground team emerged from the shadows, moving with lethal efficiency through the confusion. Ella kept her scope trained on the area, providing cover for the advancing Allies, picking off any who tried to regroup. By the time the ground team reached the bunker, the resistance had thinned to almost nothing. She watched them breach the door, disappear inside, and re-emerge minutes later, waving the all-clear signal. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her. The morning after the mission, the camp was moving with an energy Elena had not felt before. News of the raid had spread quickly, though no one openly spoke her name. She could feel the weight of eyes on her as she moved through the narrow paths. Between tents, she kept her head down, eating quickly in the mess tent and returning to clean her rifle, but the silence around her was different now, not the dismissive quiet she had known when she first arrived, but the kind that came from respect. Or maybe curiosity. Midday, the tall man returned without warning, stepping into the shaded space where she sat. He told her to walk with him, and she followed without question. They moved away from the main camp to a ridge overlooking the valley, where the river twisted like a dark ribbon far below. He said, "The black vultures will answer what happened 2 nights ago. They will send their best, and they will not come in large numbers. They will come in pairs or threes, each one a hunter in his own right. They will want to find you before you find them." Studied her for a long moment before adding, "You can leave now, return to the rear where they will never reach you, or you can stay, and when they come you will meet them on your ground." She did not answer at once. She looked out over the valley, the line of trees shifting in the breeze. The thought of running did not sit well with her. She turned back to him and said, "If they are coming, then I will be ready." He nodded once and handed her a folded map marked with several points deep in the surrounding hills. That night she prepared differently, not for a single mission, but for a hunt. She stripped her kit down to only what she could carry without slowing herself. A short supply of ammunition, her rifle, a sidearm, a small knife, a single canteen, and a packet of rations. She checked her scope, cleaned every piece of the weapon until it gleamed faintly in the lantern light, then rolled her sleeping mat and left it behind. She would not be returning to this tent soon. Before dawn, she moved out into the hills alone, following the narrow trails marked on the map. Each led to a high point or a narrow choke where movement could be seen from far away. She spent the first day walking and studying the terrain, learning every rock outcrop, every fallen log that could serve as cover. By nightfall, she had chosen 3 positions she would rotate between, never staying in one long enough to be tracked. Her instincts told her the vultures would be patient and that they would not rush into her sights, and the second morning she caught the first sign of them, a faint glimmer in the distance where the sun struck glass. For just an instant she froze, letting her breathing slow, then slowly backed away from the open ground. She circled wide, moving through a shallow ravine until she reached one of her other positions. From there she scanned the area through her scope. At first she saw nothing, then a flicker of movement, a figure in dark clothing slipping between shadows. She waited, watching, until she saw another shape, and then a third. These were no ordinary patrol. They moved too slowly, too deliberately. She could feel their eyes on the terrain the same way she studied. If they were hunters and they were close, she did not fire, not yet. Instead, she began to shift her position again, keeping low and quiet, letting them close the distance without ever knowing exactly where she was. By nightfall, she had circled behind them. It was dangerous, but she knew if she let them dictate the pace, she would lose her advantage. She crawled into position on a rocky slope overlooking a clearing where the 3 had stopped to confer. She could see their faces now, hard lines and steady eyes, each armed with rifles shorter than hers, built for close range. She took aim at the one farthest from cover, squeezed the trigger, and watched him fall before rolling away from her perch as return fire chewed into the rocks. Where she had been the next 2 days became a shifting game of pursuit and retreat. She never stayed still long enough for them to close in, striking only when the chance was certain. One fell to a clean shot at dawn, the other she caught in a narrow pass. Just as he stepped into the open, she waited a long time after the last shot, listening for movement, but the hills had fallen silent. And the third night she returned to one of her high points and lit a single covered lamp, a signal for the escorts to retrieve her. When they arrived, they found her seated on the rocks, rifle across her knees, eyes scanning the dark as though expecting another shadow to appear. When they told her the vultures were finished for now, she only nodded back at camp. The tall man met her again, this time in full daylight. He told her the hunt had been hers alone, no one else could have done it, and that the general would know who had removed the threat before it reached the camp. He handed her another insignia, this one heavier, a mark of recognition from those who operated far beyond the reach of regular forces. She took it quietly, sliding it into the same inner pocket as the first that night. As she lay awake, she knew this was only the beginning. The vultures had more than 3 hunters, and the next time they came it would not be in silence but in force, and when they did she would be ready again. The first sign came 3 weeks later, just before dawn, when the stillness of the hills broke under the sound of distant engines. Elena had been expecting this. The quiet had been too perfect to stretched like the moment before a storm. She had spent the last days mapping every path, every ridge, and every blind corner in the surrounding terrain. She had built firing points reinforced with stone and hidden in brush. She had even buried spare ammunition at key positions, knowing she would not have time to reload fully once the fight began. From the lookout post on the ridge she saw them first, dark shapes moving in lines along the lower valley, their approach careful but faster than before. She counted more than 24, maybe more, and she knew at once this was not a hunt, this was an advance meant to wipe the ridge clean. The camp below had been warned. The moment her signal flare rose into the gray light, figures began moving, hauling crates of ammunition, setting up heavy weapons at choke points, medics clearing space for the wounded. The air was already thick with the tension of what was about to come. Took her position at the forward edge of the ridge, rifle braced against the low wall of rock, her scope scanning the approach. The vultures were spreading out now, each group using the terrain to cover their advance. She waited until the lead elements reached the halfway point before taking her first shot. The man dropped instantly and his partner froze, scanning for the source of the fire. Elena shifted slightly, put her second shot through his chest, and then rolled away before their return fire tore into the stones down the slope. The rest of the defenders opened up, machine guns thundering as mortar began to fall into the narrow approaches. The enemy kept coming, moving low, using smoke to blind the ridge. For a moment she could hear nothing but the roar of gunfire, the crack of rifles, and the sharp impact of rounds hitting stone and dirt. She reloaded quickly, fingers working by instinct, eyes always searching for the next target, her breathing steady despite the chaos. A sudden shout from the left drew her attention. A group of vultures had broken through a shallow gully, avoiding the main fire. They were climbing fast toward a section of the ridge where the defense was thin. She grabbed her rifle and sprinted along the narrow trench, reaching the position just as the first enemy appeared over the rise. Her shot dropped him. The second she caught before he could fire back. The third lunged forward too close for her rifle, so she let it drop and drew her sidearm, firing twice at point blank. The slope fell silent again, but only for a heartbeat. The enemy began to press harder, bringing up heavier weapons. RPG fire slammed into the rocks, throwing dust and shards into the air. She moved quickly, keeping low, shifting from point to point, never letting them fix her position. Twice she felt the shock of rounds pass close enough to tear the edge of her jacket, but she kept moving, always firing, always forcing them to slow their climb. Through the haze she saw the tall man fighting alongside the defenders, his commands cutting through the noise with precision. He caught her eye for just a moment and gave a sharp nod as if to say, "Hold it here," and she understood that the ridge was the only thing keeping the camp alive. If it fell, everything behind it would follow. As the battle dragged into its second hour, the vultures began to falter. Their advance slowed, their lines breaking under the relentless fire. The defenders pressed harder. Elena shifted to her highest position near the center of the ridge where her view stretched across the valley. She picked targets one by one, each shot clean, each one forcing the enemy to drop or scatter. She could feel the tide turning, though her shoulders ached and her hands were raw from the constant motion. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. The enemy began to pull back, at first in small groups, then in a steady retreat, leaving their dead behind. Smoke still hung over the valley, but the sound of their engines grew fainter as they disappeared into the hills. The defenders did not chase them, not yet. They held their ground, weapons ready in case it was a feint, but after long minutes it was clear the vultures were Gennady. Ridge was quiet again, though the ground was littered with shell casings and the sharp smell of cordite hung in the air. Elena lowered her rifle and took a long breath, her heartbeat finally slowing. She turned to see the general climbing toward her, surrounded by a small escort, his uniform dusty, his eyes fixed on her. When he reached her position, he stood in silence for a long moment, then asked simply, "Who took that shot at the star?" The tall man stepped forward and said her name.